A world premiere, an original concert by the Indianapolis Chamber Orchestra dedicated to 9 extraordinary individuals who, although they come from different lands and languages, from wealth and power to poverty and politics, all share the same title, Peacemakers.
James Aikman's Peacemakers, a filmic oratorio, is made possible in part through the generous support of Eskenazi Health, advancing the role of art in health and healing.
Good evening, everyone. Great to have you tuning in. We've got a great program tonight, and I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague and very good friend, David Murray. David, you did a brilliant job last week hosting our mocktails and masterpieces. Thanks for being the guest on tonight. Great to see you. How is everything for you?
Oh, everything's fine for me, Matthew, or Maestro Kramer, as I should call you. You're my boss when you're on the podium, so.
No. I have so much admiration and respect for your artistry, David, and your career, and the really pioneering work that you've done to bring solo-based repertoire into concert halls and to create new arrangements and new works. And that's really the gist of this broadcast tonight. We've got James Aikman's Peacemakers, 2 movements, the Prelude and the Anwar Sadat movement. And we thought we would take this opportunity to talk about not only the ICO's longstanding commitment to new music, performing and commissioning the works of living composers, but also specifically your work, working with living composers. And I just want to start right off by asking, what are some of the challenges and some of the rewards of working with living composers and playing new music?
Well, one of the biggest things is that you can actually talk to the composer. And I mean, wouldn't we love to be able to talk to Bach and say, well, what should we do here? Or Beethoven and say, did you really mean this? Because that music has gone through many edits over time. And I would love to have a time machine and go back and talk to Bach and say, what do you think about this here and that there? But at least with living composers, you can ask them specifically, things about tempo, things about color, things about articulation, and they can share. I remember, I forget which composer it was exactly I worked with. And I remember playing something and he said, oh, it shouldn't be like that. And I said, but that's like in the score. And he said, no, that was a misprint. So that's nice to have that information. It's like, oh, it shouldn't be done that way. It should be done this way because the composer said so. Sometimes it's nerve-wracking having the composer in the audience. And some composers are more specific and more particular than others. There's a piece that I actually played on this program, a video of it from a couple of weeks ago called B.B. Wolf. Yes. And the composer John Deek was in the audience once, very early on when I was playing it. And I was really nervous because I didn't know how he'd react, but he was wonderful. And he said, yeah, you should take it and make it your own. And you do a little bit of this here and, you put your own spin on it, which was very comforting. And I'm really glad that he enjoyed it. But then I also played a couple of years ago at a festival in Canada, over the whole festival with the solo bass piece by their guest composer they had. And I arrived only the day before. We had an ICO concert like 2 nights before. So I had ICO concert, travel day, and then concert day. So it was a really quick turnaround. And I had never met the man. The name is of the piece is Bass Trip. And it's a really cool piece. And then you can't say it too fast. It sounds like bass strip. So bass trip. So the composer also is Estonian, Petras Vasks. And the piece is devilishly difficult. I mean, just incredibly insane. Lots of double stops and really crazy. Your hand kind of has to look like this most of the time. And at the end, you have to either sing or whistle this melody while you play a pizzicato accompaniment. And the way I perceived it, after weeks of working on it, was different than what he wanted. I was thinking it was a little more melancholy, and he said, no, it should be more upbeat, a little faster tempo. So on a dime, I had to really fix that because he was very specific about how he wanted that. So you never know when you're about to perform a piece.
You make a very interesting point here, specifically about your instrument. I mean, you think about violin and piano. They've been solo instruments with orchestras for centuries. But the double bass, there were, of course, Bottesini, Dragonetti, a few other composers, but really the instrument came into its own in the 20th century. And Gary Carr and Kusevitsky, and then, now with, your work and some of the other bassists, Edgar Meyer, who are doing, commissioning new works. It's a phenomenally misunderstood instrument, as we were just talking about the nature of artificial and natural harmonics and how many conductors get so confused and musicians get confused about which note you're actually, but you're talking about, the same thing that Paganini did to the violin, that people thought certain things were impossible. And then somebody proves that they can do it. And the next thing you know, composers are continuing to do that. And I'll share one memory I have of you. And I want you to talk about this. When I was, many people might not know that you're not only my friend and colleague, but you're also a former teacher of mine at Butler University. Chamber music courses.
I got the white hair to prove it.
My most memorable concert in my time at Butler was actually a program of all living composers, the Corelliano First Symphony, and John Downey bass concerto, where you soloed. And in a time for a young musician in college and even before that in youth orchestras, you're really learning the core repertoire for the first time, Beethoven symphonies, Brahms, etc. But this was the first program that I had ever performed publicly with living composers, and that piece just really stuck with me. And you've done this your entire career, championed living composers. Tell us a little bit about your work specifically with this bass concerto and other instances like this.
Yeah, well, going back to that performance, I remember that. It was 23 years ago. It was my first year at Butler. And so the summer before I started, Stan DeRusha, who was conducting the orchestra, the Butler Orchestra at the time, contacted me and said he'd love to do this bass concerto. And I said, oh, I'd be excited to do it. That'd be great. And I'd never heard it and I'd never played it. The music is very difficult to get because it's not been published. There's no piano reduction. So people really don't play it. I think I was about the third or maybe fourth bass player in the world to play it. It was written and commissioned actually by my teacher, Gary Carr. So he'd done it. And then John Downey was from Milwaukee. So Roger Ruggieri, who's the principal or was the principal at the time, performed it. So I was really excited to take that on because it's incredibly difficult. It's very virtuosic. And here's a piece written by a non-bassist. So he had to talk with Gary and work with Gary to see what would work. And that didn't make it any easier, but but it was also really great because I had a really big coaching session during the preparation for that concert with John Downey. And again, that's where it's so nice to work with the composer and just get exactly how he wants everything. Which meant maybe some tempos were different, the idea, the feeling, and really making sure that the character of what he's composing comes across. So I remember doing this in Clues. It was really exciting because John Corelliano was here too, and the Butler Orchestra did an incredible performance of his first symphony. And I remember how moving that was and how exciting it was to have both those composers here. And that was just before Corelliano won his Oscar. So I think he's kind of almost untouchable now, but I think we were really lucky to have him because he's such an amazing and prolific American composer. And so is John Downey. It's unfortunate John died a couple of years ago, but he's written a couple of other pieces for bass, to his Silhouette, which I played here on a recital at Butler, just solo bass. So it's really exciting to be a part of that. You just feel like you're right in the moment. I mean, thinking about how exciting it would have been to have been involved in the first performance of like Beethoven's Ninth or something like that, and not knowing where that would go in the future.
I think you hit on it perfectly. I mean, the real joy, the real inspiration of performing music of our time with living composers is that connection to the composer, because no matter what they write for 2 or 5 pages, at the first page of the score to try to explain the piece or what certain things mean and what to look for, nothing would replace the actual time that you spend with them. And once you start rehearsing the piece, to be able to go back to them with questions and that kind of, that tactile contact that you have with a specific moment in time with a composer, and they're always changing their minds, as anybody would, as these things evolve. So I think this is a great point for us to go over to the opening, the prelude of Peacemakers. Talking about personal connections of composer James Aikman has been the ICO's composer in residence now for several years, and he knows the musicians of the orchestra so well. This piece was really a great endeavor, certainly the most ambitious project the ICO has ever had, with the sheer number of performers, 2 choirs, sitar, piano, mezzo-soprano. It was 2 narrators, very, very rewarding, and obviously the benefits of that, we won a regional Emmy for the broadcast of this performance. So I invite anybody who's tuning in right now to send us some questions on our Facebook page. When David and I come back after the prelude, we'll continue this conversation, answer any questions you might have. But right now, here's James Aikman's Prelude from Peacemakers. Welcome back, everybody. I just it's like I remember this yesterday, even though this was April 2016. Certainly, such an incredibly ambitious piece. James did a masterful job of setting each movement to such a specific vision and voice of each person. This was the prelude, and of course, as you read all of these great quotes from world leaders, from peacemakers in history. We had a couple of wonderful comments here. You know, we should perform this regularly. We are so grateful to WFYI and all of our partners that we were able to record this on DVD. Again, it did win a regional Emmy, and we are able to share that. The sheer undertaking, as you can imagine. We did have another question about what's it like to navigate so many different components on a stage, and this was a huge undertaking. What you see on the stage in front of you is just part of it, because backstage, all of these choruses and soloists had to be ushered in one direction or another, so we didn't have a bottleneck backstage getting on and off. And just again, I've never worked with a sitar player before, and certainly having a saxophone and piano and two narrators and all of the visual elements brilliantly created by Mike Hallards, who will be on with us 2 weeks from now to talk about that with the next Peacemaker module. Really very, very gratifying. But we're here with David Murray again. We do want to talk about the music of our time, working with living composers. David, I just like to keep things a little bit on the lighter side. I do want you to share if you have some personal anecdotes of maybe some disasters that have happened with new music sometimes, when things, because the unexpected is always expected.
Well, that's true.
Happened to you.
You never know. The good thing, though, about a piece, especially a new piece that nobody's heard before, if something goes wrong, nobody knows. And as long as people on the stage don't let on, you can get away with an awful. It was supposed to sound that way. I remember playing a piece once by a composer, and it was at a bass festival, and it was written for like 40 parts, you know, and there were 40 bass players playing. It was, I mean, I don't think he talked to anybody about, well, does this work better or this work better? He just threw a bunch of notes on the page. And I remember we were all playing through this and practicing, and how do you rehearse 40 basses like corralling cats? I mean, it was crazy. And so we played this thing, and it was an outdoor concert to boot, which is acoustically not always ideal. But the composer was so happy because we were playing his music. So there's that side of it.
Oh, it's terrific. I remember one experience at this. I was awarded a fellowship for the 2006 Salzburg Festival with the Vienna Philharmonic and all these great orchestras. It was the Mozart year, so everything was Mozart except for works by living composers added to that mix. And there was a world famous conductor and cellist performing this avant-garde cello concerto, and there was a cadenza. And all of a sudden, the conductor brought the orchestra in, and I heard, this is a rehearsal, I heard the cellist yell, "I'm not done yet." And the conductor just kept going. It was just, I saw the score, it was just black with notes. And so, you know, that's the great thing really about the music of our time, is that it has diverged in so many directions, so many different assimilations of different kinds of music. So when we're really talking about new music, we're talking about every facet of musical style that you can imagine. I was just going through tabulating here. Since I've been music director, the ICO has a very long history of performing new music, but just in the 5 years I've been with the orchestra, we performed over 30 living composers. You know, a couple milestones here, of course, you know, big names like Thomas Addies and Christopher Rouse, Stacey Garrett, but also being part of consortiums and commissioning projects. Next season, we have 2 world premieres, including the saxophone concerto of James Aikman, which was rescheduled because of COVID, but also a work by Renato Moya dealing with climate change and the deforestation of the Amazon. We've had works for the Toulmin Commission for women composers. We were awarded a grant. And Michael Torke's Sky violin concerto for Tessa Lark, we were part of the consortium that helped commission that piece. So the ICO, for anybody tuning in, has long before my time, always championed new music and worked with living composers to give performances and to make new music part of the classical music lexicon. So again, if anybody else is out there with questions, would like to ask, we're going to go back to that last segment, the Anwar Sadat movement of Peacemakers. David and I will come back and wrap everything up with any additional questions you might have. So here's Anwar Sadat from James Aikman's Peacemakers.
President Anwar Sadat's decision to address the Israeli Knesset in Jerusalem in 1977 while still in a state of war shows the immense dignity of this remarkable man. His enemies hoped that he would not follow through on giving the speech. But the Egyptian leader's time in Israel was and remains one of the most stunning and brave feats in human history, overcoming his past military career and hatred, putting peace and forgiveness ahead of his own safety in his plea for genuine, sincere peace.
I have chosen this difficult road, which is considered in the opinion of many the most difficult road. I have chosen to come to you with an open heart and an open mind. I have chosen to give this great impetus to all international efforts exerted for peace. I have chosen to present to you, and in your own home, the realities devoid of any schemes or whims, not to maneuver or to win a round, but for us to win together the most dangerous of rounds and battles in modern history. The battle of permanent peace based on justice. It is not my battle alone, nor is it the battle of the leadership in Israel alone. It is the battle of all and every citizen in all our territories whose right it is to live in peace. It is the commitment of conscience and responsibility in the hearts of millions for the smile of every child born on our land.
It's bringing back such great memories now of this performance. Again, in 2 weeks, we'll have two other two other modules from this movie, from this great performance. Another great question here from a listener. Can you talk about the role of the conductor with a piece of this magnitude? How many additional assistants did you have? I had no assistants for this. There was an operator in the booth who was working with the videographer to make sure that all of the video stills that had moving parts that were coordinated with the music were in sync with the score. I can speak about one particular part of this Peacemakers, and it's the ending. The final four movements, there are four poems by Jimmy Carter, and the text was actually shown like one line at a time. And so in sheer panic mode, because I've done plenty of live films with orchestral accompaniment where you're either on a click track or you have a clock or a timer so that the music is perfectly synchronized with the film. I knew that if I was a fraction of a second, behind or ahead, that would snowball after 15 seconds. And so the Mike Hallertz, the brilliant videographer who created the film, put in a time code for me, really at the 11th hour. And so I was able to notate in my score where I needed to be so I could push the music or pull it back so that the words of the chorus were synchronized. So there were a lot of moving parts to this. 170 musicians were on stage for Peacemakers. So certainly the most ambitious project we've ever had. David, I want to turn it back to you here. We were just talking about the importance first of all, I wish our listening audience could hear the conversation we had during the break here. It's very educational for me, but we were just talking about the importance of new music for students and in the world of competitions, because there's no performance history. You can listen to a Beethoven symphony by Furtwängler, you can listen to it by John Elliott Gardner, two dramatically different worlds. But with new music, there's no recorded history. Talk to us, if you will, about the benefits of learning new music, of championing new music.
Well, first of all, new music is a challenge. I'm going to pull up one piece. It was written back in the 60s or 70s, I think, by Jacob Druckmann.
Oh.
And, I mean, you couldn't really just sight read this like you might a Mozart piece, It's very challenging. Modern composers have really pushed the limits of all instruments and done extended techniques. With a string instrument, for instance, it's using the bow in different ways. There's one piece I have where you take the end of the bow and you stick it in the strings and wiggle it back and forth. It's a great sound. I should have just had the bass here ready to go. And wind instruments, taking the reed out and just blowing air through the oboe and you hear the clacking keys. Some really interesting effects, and it depends on the piece of music. Prepared piano, of course, that's a big thing. John Cage did that a lot, sticking things in the strings so you get different sounds coming out of the piano. But just challenging in the technical ability and the technical things that we have to do in the instrument. So a lot of competitions will have a new piece composed for the competition that all or most of the performers, depends where it falls in the competition, have to perform. And there's no reference point. So it allows the performer to really make that piece their own because there's nothing to compare it to. So it's kind of interesting to hear that in competition because you hear different interpretations of that piece, different tempos, different colors, different shading, they just bring out different elements in the music. So for competitions, it's really beneficial. It really can make the judges listen and decide, oh, this person really took some chances here, or they really delved into the piece and really made it more exciting or more interesting or whatever. So for the competitions, I think it's really important. But I just like it as a challenge. Not that Beethoven 9 isn't challenging, and I love it. It's great to do the classics, but there's something just really exciting about getting a piece of music, learning your part, trying to figure out how it all fits together, working with the conductor, and then, having a performance a couple of days later of a piece that we really didn't know anything about.
That's terrific insight, David. I appreciate that, immensely. We were talking about all of the new music that the ICO has done. And, one of the things to mention is the earshot composer readings that we did several years ago with the American Composers Orchestra. We solicited scores nationally, hundreds of applications. We selected 5 composers to come in and workshop their pieces with the orchestra. We had a performance and we gave them a recording of that. And what was so, and I have done numerous of these earshot readings with the American Composers Orchestra. What was so interesting for our patrons, though, is they saw the inside process during these open rehearsals. They saw the composers hearing their piece for the first time, talking with me, talking with principals like you about the great aspects of their piece, but also the things that weren't practical or not realistic or frankly impossible on an instrument. So it was all part of this process of working with the next generation of composers to teach them. And next season, I'm very proud to say we made a lot of very prudent decisions about programming because of the current situation that we're in, but we kept 4 living composers on our new season, including 2 world premieres, 2 commissions on top of that. So we will continue the ICO going forward to make new music one of the pivotal points in our artistic vision. And I'm very proud of all of the work that all of us have done, all of our colleagues, David, and all the work that you've done in the work of new music. So thanks for joining me. It's always good to see you, friend.
Oh, it's a pleasure. My pleasure, definitely. Thank you for all that you do for us and for new music, too.
Oh, you're very generous, David. But thanks for all of you tuning in. I'll be back here next Thursday for another one of these mocktails and masterpieces. Just great to have all of you in the ICO family. So thanks for joining us. Thanks again, David. We'll see all of you soon.
Pleasure.